Right now, a dome of hot air the size of a continent is pressing down on the United States, trapping more than 200 million people beneath it. The nation's capital just baked to its hottest 4th of July ever recorded. Ahead of you, a temperature your thermometer hides, a 6-hour line that kills healthy adults, and a city that once filled trucks with its dead. If this grips you, like and subscribe. Prepare yourselves. We begin. On the 4th of July, Washington threw the biggest fireworks display in its history. Crowds packed the grassy length of the National Mall, flags waved, children rode on shoulders, and above all of it, the air itself had turned dangerous. The thermometer climbed to 102 degrees. That reading broke a record standing since the year 1872, set back when the men who first measured it wore wool suits and travelled by horse. It became the hottest 4th of July the capital had ever recorded. A country was celebrating its birthday inside an oven. You could feel it with every breath. The air came in warm and thick and heavy. Sweat rose on the skin and then just sat there, refusing to dry. People fanned themselves with folded paper programs. They drank water until the vendors ran empty. The fireworks still lit the sky that night, bright and loud and beautiful. Yet all through the day, medics moved through the crowd, carrying people out on stretchers, their bodies overwhelmed by something invisible. Washington was only one dot on the map. The same suffocating heat stretched across more than 2/3 of the country at the very same moment. Over 200 million people, the majority of everyone living in the United States, woke that week beneath one enormous mass of hot air. Philadelphia and New York City brushed 100 degrees. Cities across the middle of the country baked for days on end. This was a single event large enough to swallow a continent. Think about what that scale really means. Picture a lid, clear and vast, laid down over the eastern half of the country. Under it, the heat had nowhere to run. It built through the morning, peaked in the afternoon, and barely eased at night. Then the sun rose and started the whole cycle over, each day stacking on the last. The people at those celebrations were doing nothing wrong. They came out for a holiday, the way families have for generations. They stood in the sun because the calendar told them it was a day for joy. The old rules said a summer afternoon was safe. The heat that week had stopped obeying the old rules. Emergency rooms filled. In the days around the holiday, health officials reported extremely high rates of heat-related visits, waves of people arriving dizzy and confused, their skin hot and dry. Doctors know this pattern well. One New York emergency physician described watching heat stroke come through his doors on days that looked exactly like the ones ahead. He called it fast, deadly, and almost always preventable. That last word matters. Preventable. It tells you that heat like this does its killing quietly, and that most of its victims never see it coming. They feel a little tired, a little foggy. They sit down to rest, and by the time anyone notices the danger, the body has already crossed a line it cannot walk back from. This was the opening act of a summer that forecasters had warned would be historic. The dome that cooked Washington came first, and the pattern feeding it was only growing stronger. Because behind all of this sits a machine in the sky, a structure most people have never had explained to them. Once you understand how that machine works, you will never look at a hot week the same way again. Meteorologists have a name for that invisible lid. They call it a heat dome, and once you see how one forms, the whole summer starts to make sense. Begin miles above the ground, high up where the great rivers of air flow around the planet. Sometimes a mountain of high pressure builds in that upper air and parks itself over one region. High pressure pushes down. As the air sinks toward the ground, it gets squeezed, and squeezing air heats it, the same way a bicycle pump grows warm in your hand when you press the plunger fast. The air near the surface, already hot from the summer sun, gets pressed down and warmed even more. That sinking air also does something sneaky. It flattens the sky. It drives away the tall clouds that would normally build in the afternoon and bring rain and shade. So the sun beats down on the land with nothing to soften it. The ground bakes, the hot ground warms the air above it, and that warmer air feeds the dome, making it stronger. The loop feeds itself. Picture a glass lid set over a simmering pot. The heat rising off the stove cannot escape. It gathers under the lid, growing thicker and hotter with every passing minute. A heat dome does the same thing to whole states at once. The lid this summer covered land stretching from the Midwest to the East Coast, one structure spanning a distance you could not drive across in a single day. The word dome is exactly right, because the shape matters. It bulges upward, a swollen ridge of high pressure arching over the land, and the taller and stronger that ridge grows, the harder it presses down. Here is where the humidity sneaks in. As the trapped air sits over farm fields and forests and city rivers, it draws moisture up into itself. The dome becomes a warm, wet blanket. That is why the misery of these events is more than a high number on a thermometer. It is the wet, airless quality of it, the sense that you are breathing through a hot towel pressed over your face. Under that lid, the numbers climb to places that frighten even seasoned forecasters. In some spots this summer, the combination of heat and humidity made the air feel like 115 degrees. The National Weather Service reached for a word it uses carefully. It called the conditions dangerous, and it warned that dozens of temperature records could fall in a matter of days, and they did. City after city from the Midwest through the Northeast watched their old marks tumble. Some of those records had stood for more than a century, quiet lines in a dusty logbook that no one expected to break in a lifetime. The dome erased them in an afternoon. A heat dome is a natural thing. Ridges of high pressure have always drifted across the summer sky. What has changed is how hot the starting air already is, and how often these domes lock into place and simply refuse to move, because that is the truly frightening part of this year's event. A hot day passes, a heat dome that will not leave becomes something else entirely, a slow siege that grinds down a body over many days. So the real question rises up on its own. What holds a dome in place for a week, when every instinct says the weather should move along? The answer lives in a river of wind far overhead, and this year that river had gone strangely still. High above your head, faster than any airliner, a river of wind circles the planet. Pilots ride it, storms follow it. It is called the jet stream, and it is the reason weather moves. The jet stream flows between the cold air of the north and the warm air of the south. It behaves like a fast current at the boundary of two great pools of temperature, and normally it hums along at a brisk pace, dragging weather systems across the country from west to east. A storm rolls in, rains for a day, and moves on. A hot spell arrives, then slides off to make room for cooler air. That steady march is the ordinary rhythm of the sky, and it keeps any single pattern from lasting too long. Now imagine that river slowing down. When it loses speed, it stops flowing in a straight, tidy line. It begins to wander, looping far to the north and dipping far to the south, carving huge, lazy bends like an old river winding across flat land. Those bends are the key to everything. When a giant northward bend of the jet stream parks over a region, it traps a ridge of high pressure underneath. The weather beneath that bend gets stuck. Nothing pushes it along because the current that would normally shove it eastward has coiled into a loop and gone quiet. Scientists call this a blocking pattern, and the name is perfect. The block holds the dome in place like a boulder dropped in a stream, forcing everything to pile up behind it. This is the piece most people miss. The horror of this summer's heat was less about how hot a single afternoon got. It was about how long the heat refused to leave. Day after day, the dome sat over the same cities because the river of wind above them had stalled into a wandering, sluggish shape and simply would not carry it away. Here is the part that should catch your attention. A warming world appears to slow that river down. The jet stream is powered by the difference in temperature between the cold far north and the warmer middle latitudes. The Arctic has been heating faster than almost anywhere else on Earth. As the cold end warms up, the temperature difference shrinks, and the river loses some of its push. A weaker river wanders more. It gets stuck more often. It carves those big, lazy loops more easily. Follow that chain of logic and something unsettling appears. The very warming that raises the baseline temperature may also be jamming the machinery that would normally sweep hot spells away. The heat gets hotter, and it also gets stuck. Two problems feeding into one. Think of a wide, fast river tumbling over rocks, churning and mixing, never letting anything settle. Now imagine that same river spread thin across a marsh, barely moving, water pooling in still ponds that sit for weeks. That slow marsh is the sky we are drifting toward on our hottest summers. Weather that lingers, patterns that dig in, domes that squat over a region and stay. The dome that cooked Washington was held in place by exactly this kind of stall, and forecasters watching the wider pattern saw something else lurking behind it, an ocean signal thousands of miles away that was quietly loading the whole system for more. To understand the danger fully, we first need a number almost no weather report will ever show you. It is the single most honest measure of whether heat can kill you, and most people have never heard its name. Your weather app lies to you. It does not mean to. It simply shows you a number that leaves out the one thing that decides whether heat is survivable. That number is the plain air temperature, 90 degrees, 95, 100. It feels precise and honest, yet it hides a partner, and the partner is what actually matters. That partner is humidity, and the true measure of danger blends the two together. Scientists call it the wet bulb temperature. Here is the idea, and it is beautifully simple. Take a normal thermometer and wrap its bulb in a wet cloth. As water evaporates off that cloth, it pulls heat away, and the reading drops. In dry air, plenty of water evaporates, so the wet reading falls far below the dry one. In humid air, almost no water can evaporate, because the air is already crammed with moisture. So the wet reading stays high. That wet reading is your body's reality, because your body cools itself the exact same way the wet cloth does, through evaporation, through sweat. Sweating is the human superpower against heat. You pour water onto your skin, it evaporates, and it carries your heat away with it. It is a marvel of biological engineering, an internal cooling system tuned over millions of years, and it has one fatal weakness. It only works if the sweat can actually evaporate. Now you see the trap. On a dry desert afternoon, sweat flashes off your skin almost instantly, and you can survive astonishing heat because your cooling system is running at full power. On a humid, swampy afternoon, the air is already so full of water that your sweat has nowhere to go. It beads up, it drips off, it runs down your back and does nothing to cool you, because it never evaporates. Your superpower fails. For decades, scientists marked a specific wet bulb temperature as the theoretical limit of human survival, 35 degrees on the Celsius scale, which is 95 degrees Fahrenheit measured on that wet bulb. Past that line, sweat cannot evaporate at all, and the body's only cooling mechanism shuts down completely. Let me be precise about what crossing that line means, because it is one of the most chilling ideas in all of climate science. When the wet bulb temperature reaches that limit, it no longer matters how healthy you are. It does not matter if you are a marathon runner in peak condition. It does not matter if you sit perfectly still in the shade with a cold drink in your hand. Your core temperature begins to climb slowly and relentlessly, and within roughly 6 hours, a perfectly healthy adult can die of overheating. 6 hours. For someone doing everything right. To picture that limit in the real world, here is what it takes. The air hits 95 degrees at total, saturated humidity. Or, if the air is drier, the temperature climbs to around 115 degrees at half humidity. Those combinations sound rare, and historically they were. The planet only brushed that line in its hottest, most humid corners, and only for a few minutes at a time. That was the old world. The line was a distant horror, a thing that lived in textbooks. What no weather app tells you is that the wet bulb number has been creeping upward across the American South, edging toward the line that theory said we should never approach. And there is a cruel twist to this measure, one that reveals itself only after the sun goes down. When the sun sets, everyone relaxes. The worst is over, we tell ourselves. The number on the thermometer is falling. Time to breathe. That instinct on the deadliest nights is exactly wrong. Watch what happens after dark on a swampy summer night. The temperature does slip downward. 98 becomes 90, then falls into the low 80s. Your eyes and your app both tell you relief has arrived. Meanwhile, something else is climbing. As the air cools a little, its ability to hold moisture shrinks, so the humidity rises to meet the falling temperature. The two changes cancel each other out. The wet bulb temperature, that true measure of danger, can hold stubbornly high right through the darkness. The body's situation improves far less than the dropping thermometer suggests, because the moisture is rising as fast as the heat is falling. A person lying awake in a hot apartment at 2 a.m, glancing at a thermometer that reads a merely uncomfortable number, may in truth be sitting in conditions that grind down the heart hour after hour, The human body needs the night. Daytime heat, even brutal daytime heat, is something we can endure if the darkness lets us recover. Overnight, the body is meant to shed the heat it soaked up during the day, to reset, to cool its core back to a safe baseline before morning. A hot night steals that recovery, and a string of hot nights, one after another, becomes a slow accumulation of damage that the body can never quite pay off. For a healthy young adult, that missing recovery means a rough sleep and a groggy morning. For an older person, it can mean death. The survival line for the elderly sits far lower than the famous limit. Their hearts and lungs and kidneys have less reserve, less ability to fight a rising core temperature. A night that a teenager shrugs off can quietly overwhelm a grandmother in the next room. This is why the truly lethal heat waves are so often the ones that never cool down at night. The daytime highs grab the headlines, the nighttime lows do the killing. A city that bakes to 100 degrees by day and then falls to a comfortable 70 by night gives its people a chance to recover. A city that bakes to 100 by day and only sinks to the mid-80s by night offers no mercy at all. The oven never turns off. Here is a comparison that makes it clear. Think of the body like a runner in a long race. Daytime heat is the hard uphill climb. The cool of night is the flat stretch where you catch your breath and steady your legs. Take away the flat stretch, force the runner to climb hour after hour with no rest, and eventually the strongest legs give out. The heat wave that never cools is a race with no downhill, no water station, no place to pause, and warm nights are the fastest changing part of our warming climate. Across American cities, overnight low temperatures have been rising faster than daytime highs. The nights are warming quicker than the days, which means the exact conditions that make heat waves deadly are the exact conditions increasing most rapidly. So when the sun goes down and everyone exhales, the danger is often just beginning. This quiet nighttime killing explains a strange and terrible fact about heat, one that separates it from every other disaster we fear. Ask most people to name the deadliest kind of weather in the United States, and they will guess wrong. They picture the hurricane tearing off roofs, the tornado throwing cars, the flood swallowing a town. Those disasters are terrifying and they are loud. Yet none of them is the deadliest. The deadliest weather in America is heat, and it is not close. Over recent years, extreme heat has killed roughly 2,000 Americans in a typical year, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. In the worst recent years, the toll climbed past 2,400. That is more than floods, more than tornadoes, more than hurricanes and lightning. In many years, heat kills more people than several of those other hazards combined. Sit with that for a moment. The disaster we fear the least turns out to be the one most likely to end our lives. Why does the ranking surprise everyone? Because heat breaks all the rules of how a disaster is supposed to look. A hurricane announces itself for days. It has a name. It has a track on the map, a spinning eye on the radar, reporters standing in the wind. A tornado drops from a black sky with a roar you never forget. An earthquake shakes the ground and topples buildings, and the wreckage is right there for the cameras. Heat leaves no wreckage. It topples nothing. It floods no streets. It arrives as an ordinary bright day, a little too warm, and it does its work in silence, in bedrooms and hospital wards and nursing homes, one quiet body at a time. There is no dramatic footage of a heat wave, just empty chairs, slightly more of them than there should be, scattered across a country. That invisibility has real consequences for how the country responds. For years, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the arm of the government that rushes aid to hurricanes and floods, could not formally classify extreme heat as a major disaster under the law that governs its response. A heat wave that kills hundreds does not trigger the same machinery as a storm that kills a fraction as many. The country built its disaster response around the loud catastrophes and left the quiet one out. Think of two thieves. One kicks in your door in the middle of the night, loud and violent, and you wake instantly and call for help. The other slips a key into the lock, walks in silently, and takes what he wants while you sleep, and you never even stir. Heat is the second thief. It takes far more, and almost no one raises the alarm. There is one more cruelty buried in the numbers. That toll of 2,000 a year is almost certainly too low. The true figure is likely higher, because of the strange way heat hides its victims. When heat kills, it usually does so by pushing a strained heart or a struggling kidney past the edge. So the death certificate says heart attack, it says kidney failure, It says stroke or old age. The heat that pulled the trigger goes unnamed, hidden behind a dozen other causes. Which raises a haunting question. If the official count already crowns heat the deadliest weather in the country, how many more deaths are we failing to count at all? To answer that, scientists had to invent a way to see the invisible. Here is a puzzle that troubled scientists for years. If heat hides its victims behind heart attacks and kidney failure and old age, how could anyone ever know the true number? You cannot count deaths that were labelled something else. The answer turned out to be elegant and a little eerie. You count the empty chairs. Every city has a normal rhythm of death. In a given week of summer, in a place of a certain size and age, a predictable number of people pass away from all the ordinary causes of life. Public health workers know that baseline well. It rises and falls with the seasons, but it holds a steady average. Now watch what happens when a heat wave rolls in. The number of deaths that week jumps above the baseline. More people die than the calendar says should. That gap, the difference between the deaths that happened and the deaths that were expected, has a name. Excess mortality. Excess deaths are the fingerprint of a heat wave, visible even when no single death certificate ever says the word heat. Scientists cannot always point to one body and prove the heat killed that person. What they can do is count the whole city and see the bump. 200 more deaths than normal in a week when the temperature spiked. Those 200 extra graves are the heat's true signature. When researchers apply this method to the United States, the hidden scale of the problem comes into focus. Since the start of this decade, the official count of heat-related deaths across the country has climbed past 9,000 people. And that official count is the conservative one, the number built only from certificates that actually name the heat. The excess mortality method, the one that counts the empty chairs, points to a toll larger still. Picture a classroom where the teacher takes attendance every morning. Most days, every seat is filled. Then comes a week of terrible heat, and each morning a few more seats sit empty. No note explains why. No single reason gets written in the book. But the teacher counts the empty desks week after week, and the pattern is undeniable. Something is emptying the chairs. That counting of empty desks done across an entire nation is how we finally see a killer that leaves no wreckage. The people in those empty chairs share a heartbreaking profile. They are mostly the old, whose bodies have lost the reserve to fight a rising core temperature. They are the poor, who cannot afford to run an air conditioner all night, or who have none at all. They are the isolated, the ones living alone, with no neighbour to knock on the door and notice the silence inside. Heat finds the people the rest of us have stopped checking on, and their deaths mostly get filed under other names. The certificates will say the heart gave out, that the lungs failed, that the person was simply old and it was simply their time. The heat that pushed a fragile body past its limit vanishes from the record, hiding behind a dozen more ordinary causes. Unless someone is carefully counting the excess, the disaster passes almost unseen. This is not a new horror. America already lived through one of the clearest examples on record, a catastrophe that unfolded in silence in a single great city while the rest of the country barely looked up. It happened in Chicago in the summer of 1995, and everything we now understand about heat was written in its wreckage. In July of 1995, a heat wave settled over Chicago and killed more than 700 people in about 5 days, in one American city, in less than a week. It remains one of the deadliest weather events in modern American history, and almost no one outside that city remembers it. Here is the detail that reveals everything. The peak temperature that week was 106 degrees at the Midway Airport. Hot, certainly. Brutal, yes. Yet that reading would not crack the list of the hottest days ever recorded in Arizona or Texas. Desert cities shrug off numbers like that. So why did a temperature that other places survive so easily kill hundreds of people in Chicago? The answer is the reason this whole story matters. The daytime heat was not what did the killing. The nights did. Through those 5 days, the city's urban core stayed brutally hot after dark. The overnight low sat in the upper 70s and low 80s, offering no relief, no recovery, no chance for exhausted bodies to reset. The ovens simply never cooled. Day after day, the heat accumulated in people who could never pay it back, until the most fragile among them ran out of reserve and died. When researchers later took apart what had happened, the picture that emerged was a near-perfect illustration of everything we had been building toward. The victims were overwhelmingly elderly. They were poor. They were alone. Many lived in small apartments with no air conditioning. And here is the cruelest detail of all. Many were too afraid of crime to open their windows or step outside for air. They sealed themselves inside their own homes, in neighbourhoods they no longer trusted, and those homes became ovens with the doors locked from the inside. The scale overwhelmed the city's systems. The morgue ran out of room. There were more bodies than the building could hold, and the county had to bring in refrigerated trucks, the kind used to haul frozen food, and park them outside to store the dead. Picture that. A line of freezer trucks outside a city morgue, in the middle of an American summer, filled with people whose only crime was being old and poor and alone on the wrong week. It was a disaster built entirely from the mechanisms we have already met. The wet bulb misery that would not ease, the warm nights that stole recovery, the invisible victims, hidden behind death certificates that mostly named heart attacks and strokes. Chicago in 1995 was all of it at once, decades before most people had ever heard the terms, a preview of a danger the country was not ready to name. And the country mostly did not notice. There was no dramatic footage, no flattened skyline, no flooded highway. The catastrophe unfolded in silence, in sealed apartments across the south and west sides, while much of the nation went about its summer. By the time the count was finished, more people had died in those 5 days than in most hurricanes the country trembles over. Chicago handed us a warning written in 700 graves. It told us exactly who dies in a heat wave, exactly why, and exactly what conditions do the killing. The frightening truth is that the ingredients of that disaster have not gone away. They have spread, and one of them lives in the very design of the modern city, in the concrete and the asphalt themselves. Step out of a shaded forest on a hot day and onto a bare parking lot, and you feel the difference instantly. The forest was warm, the parking lot is an oven. That leap in temperature, over a distance of a few steps, holds the secret to why cities have become the most dangerous places on Earth during a heat wave. Scientists call it the urban heat island. A city can run several degrees hotter than the green countryside surrounding it, sometimes far more. Draw the temperature across a region on a map, and the city glows like a hot coal in a bed of cooler land, an island of heat rising out of a cooler sea. On the worst nights, that island can stand many degrees above the fields just beyond its edge. The cause is written into the surfaces we build with. A field of grass or a stand of trees stays cool through a clever trick. Plants sweat, in their own way, releasing water vapour that carries heat away, the same evaporation that cools your skin. Soil holds moisture, leaves throw shade. The living landscape is a natural air conditioner, running quietly all day. Now pave it over. Replace the grass with asphalt, the trees with brick and steel and glass, the soil with concrete. Those surfaces do the opposite of a forest. They cannot sweat. They hold no moisture to evaporate. Instead, they drink in the sunlight and store it as raw heat, hour after hour, like a stone left in a fire. Dark asphalt in full sun can climb to temperatures that would burn your hand. A city is built of millions of such surfaces, each one soaking up the day. There is more feeding the island. A city runs hot on its own energy. Every car engine throws off heat. Every air conditioner working to cool one building dumps warmth out its back into the street. Every machine and light and body adds a little more. Tall buildings crowd together and block the wind that might carry heat away, and they bounce sunlight down into deep canyons of stone where it has nowhere to escape. The city generates heat, traps heat, and stores heat all at once. Picture the difference this way. The countryside on a hot day is a person in a light cotton shirt, able to breathe and cool down. The city is that same person zipped into a heavy black coat standing in the sun, unable to shed a single degree. Same weather. Two entirely different fates, and the people most exposed to this trap are, again and again, the ones with the least. The hottest neighbourhoods in a city are usually the poorest. They have the fewest trees, the most pavement, the oldest buildings, the least reliable cooling. Wealthier districts, with their leafy streets and shaded parks, can run noticeably cooler than the bare concrete neighbourhoods a few miles away. Heat follows the same fault lines as poverty, and it presses hardest exactly where people can defend themselves least. So when a heat dome parks over a country, it does not press down evenly. It finds the cities and squeezes hardest there. The very places where the most people live, packed close together, are the places the heat hits worst. But the deepest danger of the urban heat island reveals itself only after sunset, in a cruel refusal that ties back to the deadliest lesson of Chicago. The sun goes down over the countryside, and the land begins to cool almost at once. The soil gives up its warmth to the sky. The air over the fields turns soft and mild within an hour. Out there, night arrives on schedule, and with it comes relief. Now stand in the middle of a city at the same hour. The sun is gone, yet the heat has barely moved. The pavement still radiates warmth up through the soles of your shoes. The brick walls of the buildings glow with stored heat, like the sides of a wood stove hours after the fire has died. The night has come to the calendar, but it has not come to the street. This is the deadliest trick of the concrete city, and it is a matter of memory. Stone and asphalt and brick have a stubborn ability to hold heat. Scientists call it thermal mass. Through the long hours of a summer day, these dense surfaces drink in the sun's energy and store it deep inside themselves. Then, all through the night, they release it slowly back into the air. The city spent the day charging up like a giant battery, and it spends the night discharging that heat directly onto the people trying to sleep inside it. The countryside forgets the heat of the day within an hour of sunset. The city remembers it until nearly dawn, and then the sun rises and begins charging the battery all over again. Before it ever fully emptied, you have felt a small version of this. Touch a sidewalk at 9 in the evening in July and feel the warmth still pouring off it. Walk past a stone building at midnight and feel it breathing heat like a living thing. Multiply that across every surface of a vast metropolis, and you have a place that simply cannot cool down at night, no matter what the calendar says. Here is where the whole story snaps into focus. Remember the lesson written in Chicago. The nights do the killing. The body needs the darkness to shed its heat and recover, and a hot night steals that recovery away. The urban heat island, through this stubborn memory of the concrete, is a machine for manufacturing exactly the kind of hot night that empties chairs. The countryside gives its people the cool downhill stretch to catch their breath. The concrete city takes it away and forces them to keep climbing through the dark. This is why the same heat wave can be a sweaty inconvenience in a rural town and a mass casualty event in a dense city centre. Same air, same dome overhead. One place cools at night and lets its people recover. The other holds the heat in its bones until morning and lets the fragile slip away. And overnight temperatures in American cities have been climbing faster than the daytime peaks, which means this exact machine is growing more powerful with every passing decade. The nights are warming quicker than the days, and the concrete is only getting better at remembering. So the city bakes by day and refuses to cool by night, tightening its grip on the people inside. What makes this summer especially ominous is a signal rising out of the distant Pacific Ocean, a giant that has awakened and begun to breathe. It was loading the dice behind the entire pattern, and forecasters have been watching it with growing unease. Thousands of miles from any American city, out in the vast tropical Pacific Ocean, a giant stirs every few years. When it wakes, it reaches out across the whole planet and tilts the odds of every season. This year it woke up in a big way. Its name is El Niño. At its heart, El Niño is a simple thing. A huge stretch of the tropical Pacific, an expanse of ocean wider than the United States, grows warmer than usual at its surface. That may sound modest. Yet the ocean is so enormous, and water holds so much heat, that a warm Pacific pumps a staggering amount of extra warmth and moisture up into the atmosphere, and the atmosphere carries that influence around the globe. When the ocean warms, it warms the air above it, and that warmed air ripples outward through the great wind patterns of the planet. El Niño nudges the jet stream. It shifts where storms form and where they starve. It changes the odds of drought here and floods there. In its biggest years, when the warming is strong enough to earn the name Super El Niño, it becomes one of the loudest signals in the entire climate system. And this year, forecasters were pointing to exactly that. Think of the whole planet's weather as a single enormous set of dice, rolled fresh every day. Most days the roll is fair, and you get an ordinary mix of hot and cool, wet and dry. A strong El Niño walks up to the table and quietly weights the dice. It does not decide any single roll, but it tilts the whole game so that hot outcomes come up again and again, far more often than chance alone would allow. That is exactly the danger this year. On its own, El Niño raises the odds of a hotter than normal year across much of the country. Now lay that on top of a world already warmed by a century of rising temperatures, and the two effects stack. The background heat lifts the entire playing field higher. El Niño then tilts the tilted field even further toward the hot end. Roll those loaded dice through an American summer, and record heat stops being a surprise. It becomes the expected result. There is a reason forecasters watch the Pacific so closely months before summer even begins. The ocean gives them a head start. A giant El Niño building in the spring is a warning flare, telling them the coming season carries extra risk before the first heat dome has even formed. This year, that flare went up early and burned bright. The warnings of a historic summer were written in the Pacific long before Washington ever hit 102 degrees. And here is the sobering part. El Niño is a natural cycle. It has come and gone for thousands of years, long before humans changed the air. What is different now is the floor it stands on. Each El Niño arrives on top of a baseline that keeps climbing, so each one has the power to push the thermometer to heights the last one could not reach. The giant wakes on higher ground every time, so the dice were loaded, the dome was locked in place, and the nights refused to cool. Then, just as the eastern heat began to break, the pattern did something that turned one disaster into two. The dome did not simply fade away, it packed up and moved west. By early July, the great dome that had cooked the eastern half of the country finally began to loosen its grip. Records had fallen, emergency rooms had filled, and as the pattern shifted, the exhausted cities of the east started to breathe again. The relief felt like the end of the story. It was the intermission. The same blocking pattern that trapped the heat over the east did not simply vanish into thin air. It reorganized. The ridge of high pressure shifted its weight across the map, and a second heat dome began to build over the western half of the continent. The heat had not ended. It had relocated, swinging from one side of the country to the other, like a spotlight sliding across a stage. This is a pattern worth understanding because it multiplies the danger. When the jet stream locks into those big lazy loops we met earlier, it can set up a kind of seesaw. Heat piles up on one side, breaks, and then the whole arrangement tips and rebuilds the pile on the other side. One nation, two domes, one summer. The West had spent the early season with its own heat and its own fires, and now the giant lid came swinging back over it. The timing carried a special cruelty. The West's heat was building just as the region's summer rains, the seasonal downpours known as the North American monsoon, were trying to arrive. Those rains are the desert Southwest's yearly relief, the storms that break the heat and green the land. A strong dome of high pressure can hold them off, its lid of sinking air smothering the storms before they form, delaying the very rains that would end the misery. Picture a game of whack-a-mole, played across a country. The heat rises in the east and everyone rushes to respond, opening cooling centres, checking on the elderly, bracing for the worst. Then it drops back down, and everyone exhales. And in the same motion it pops up again 1,000 miles to the west, where a new set of cities must scramble to face it from the start. The threat never truly leaves the board. It just changes its address. For the country as a whole, this seesaw means the summer offers few true breaks. A city cannot count on a heatwave being a single event to endure and forget. It becomes part of a pattern that keeps returning. First here, then there, then back again. Emergency systems that might handle one crisis get worn down by a season of them. The workers who staff cooling centres, the crews who check on vulnerable residents, the hospitals that absorb the surge, all of them face wave after wave with no clean finish line. And the West received this returning heat in a uniquely dangerous condition. The eastern cities had faced the dome with full reservoirs and green summer landscapes. The West met its dome parched. Much of the region was already gripped by drought, its soil cracked, its forests dry as kindling. Heat landing on wet ground is one kind of problem. Heat landing on a landscape already starved of water is another kind entirely. Because when a heat dome settles over a drought, the two disasters stop being separate. They begin to feed each other, locking into a vicious cycle that can turn an entire region into a tinderbox. And that is exactly what was unfolding across the American West. Heat and drought look like two separate disasters. In the American West, they are two faces of one machine, and each one makes the other worse. Understand how they lock together, and you understand why a single hot summer can leave an entire region primed to burn. Start with the ground. Moist soil is a shield against extreme heat, and the reason is that same trick of evaporation we keep returning to. When the sun beats down on damp earth, much of that energy goes into evaporating the water, lifting it into the air as vapor. That evaporation carries heat away, the way sweat cools your skin, and it keeps the ground and the air above it cooler than they would otherwise be. Wet land sweats, and a sweating landscape stays cool. Now let a drought dry that soil out. The shield is gone. When the sun strikes parched, cracked earth, there is no water left to evaporate, so all that energy goes straight into heating the ground and the air. The same sunlight that a wet landscape would have partly spent on evaporation now goes entirely into raw temperature. Dry ground bakes hotter, and hotter air in turn pulls even more moisture out of whatever soil and plants remain, drying the land further still. There is the trap, closing on itself. Drought makes the heat worse. The worse heat deepens the drought, round and round, each turn tightening the next, a loop that can lock a region into a spiral of ever drier, ever hotter conditions. Scientists watched this exact feedback grip the West this year, as a landscape already short on water met a dome of relentless heat. The end product of that loop is fire. A forest baked by weeks of heat and starved of water becomes a field of kindling stretching for miles. The living moisture that normally makes green wood resist a flame is cooked out of it. Leaves turn brittle, grasses go brown and crisp. All it takes then is a spark, from a lightning strike, a stray ember, a downed power line, and the whole prime landscape can erupt. This summer, forests across the West were already burning at a scope and intensity unusual for so early in the season. Helicopters dropped water on flames climbing dry hillsides. Crews raced to protect towns, and behind every one of those fires stood the same quiet driver, a land cooked dry by heat and then set alight. Picture a sponge and a matchstick. A wet sponge cannot catch fire no matter how many matches you touch to it, because the water soaks up the heat and smothers the flame. Let that sponge dry out completely in the sun, and one match turns it to ash in seconds. The heat and drought loop is the process that wrings the sponge dry. The West spent this summer being wrung out, hillside by hillside, until vast stretches of it waited only for a match. And a burning, baking West is not a problem that stays in the West. The smoke rides the wind for thousands of miles, dimming the sun and fouling the air over cities far away. The heat and the fire and the haze become a single connected event spanning the continent. Yet even a landscape on fire depends on something most people never think about until it fails. Every cooling centre, every hospital, every air conditioner fighting to keep people alive runs on one fragile thing, and extreme heat pushes that very thing to the breaking point. On the hottest day of the year, when the heat becomes a matter of life and death, survival for millions of people comes down to a single lifeline: the electric grid. And the cruel irony of extreme heat is that it attacks that lifeline at the exact moment we need it most. Here is the squeeze. When a heat dome settles over a region, nearly everyone reaches for the same defense at the same time. They turn on the air conditioning and they turn it up. Across an entire city, millions of cooling units switch on together and run flat out for hours. The demand for electricity soars to its yearly peak, all of it crashing onto the grid in the same sweltering afternoon. At the same instant, the heat is quietly weakening the grid's ability to deliver. Power plants run less efficiently when the air they use for cooling is scorching. Transmission lines carry less current when they are hot, and they sag under their own warmth. The heat drives demand to its ceiling while pushing supply toward its floor. Those two lines race toward each other, and where they meet is the danger zone. Picture a bridge with a posted weight limit. On an ordinary day, the traffic crossing it stays comfortably under the limit, and the bridge holds with room to spare. Now imagine the hottest afternoon of the summer, when every driver in the region tries to cross at once, bumper to bumper, the load climbing toward the maximum the bridge was ever built to carry. That is the grid on a heat dome afternoon, groaning under a weight near the very edge of what it can bear. When the load finally exceeds what the system can supply, something has to give. Utilities may be forced to cut power to some areas on purpose, rolling the outage from neighbourhood to neighbourhood to keep the whole grid from collapsing, or the system fails on its own and the lights simply go out. Either way, the result is the same nightmare. The power dies during the deadliest heat, and the air conditioners that were keeping people alive fall silent all at once. That is the moment the disaster turns lethal at scale. A blackout on a mild day is an inconvenience. A blackout in the middle of a record heat wave is a mass casualty risk. Every home that loses power becomes a sealed box heating up toward the outside temperature. Every hospital and nursing home falls back on emergency generators that were meant for short outages. The most vulnerable people, the exact ones we have met again and again, the old and the poor and the alone, lose the one machine standing between them and a rising core temperature, and the danger is growing on both ends of the wire. The heat waves are getting hotter and more frequent, pushing demand higher each year. Much of the grid is aging, built for a climate that no longer exists. We're asking older and older equipment to carry heavier and heavier loads in harsher and harsher conditions. The grid, in the end, is the thin line between a heatwave being survivable and a heatwave being deadly. So it is worth walking through exactly what happens when that line breaks, when the power dies and the cooling stops. Because the collapse that follows, inside a single hot home, is faster and more merciless than most people imagine. Imagine the moment the power fails on the worst afternoon of the summer. The hum of the air conditioner stops, the house falls quiet, and a countdown begins that most people have never thought about because they have never had to. For the first few minutes, nothing seems to change. The house is still cool. You wait, expecting the power to flicker back on the way it usually does. But the walls and the air have started a slow, silent slide, and the direction is only one way: warmer. Inside a sealed modern home, the heat climbs faster than instinct expects. A house with the cooling off on a 100-degree day is a closed box sitting in the sun. It absorbs heat through the roof, the walls, the windows, and it holds that heat inside. Within an hour or two, the temperature indoors can climb toward the temperature outside, and in a top-floor apartment under a baking roof, it can push even higher than the air in the street. The refuge becomes a trap. Now the human body, robbed of its cool room, is left to fight the heat with sweat alone, that ancient superpower we met earlier. And in the thick, humid air of a heat dome, sweat is losing the battle because it cannot evaporate fast enough to carry the heat away. So the body's core temperature begins to rise. This is where the cascade starts, and it runs in a terrible order. First comes heat exhaustion. The person feels weak and dizzy. Their head aches. They may feel sick to their stomach, confused, strangely tired. The heart races, pumping hard to move blood to the skin in a desperate effort to shed warmth. If they can cool down now, drink water, find shade or a breeze, they can still recover. If the heat keeps rising, the body crosses into heat stroke, and this is the killing stage. The core temperature climbs so high that the body's controls begin to fail. In a final, catastrophic betrayal, sweating can stop altogether, and the skin turns hot and dry. Now the last cooling mechanism is gone. The temperature spikes. The brain, which cannot tolerate that kind of heat, begins to swell and misfire. Confusion turns to slurred speech, to stumbling, to collapse. Organs start to shut down. Without fast emergency cooling, heat stroke kills or leaves permanent damage in those it spares. The whole cascade can run its course in a matter of hours, which is exactly why a blackout during extreme heat is so lethal. The line between a cool, safe living room and a fatal medical emergency is thinner than a single afternoon. It is the width of one failed power line. Think of the body as a building with its own sprinkler system, designed to fight the fire of overheating. Sweating is the sprinkler. In humid heat, the sprinkler runs, but the water does no good, and as the fire spreads, the system finally shorts out and stops entirely. From that point, the fire climbs unchecked toward the top floors, toward the brain and the heart, and there is no time left to waste. This is the true stakes of every cooling centre, every welfare check, every working air conditioner. They are the barrier holding back that cascade. and some Americans face this danger not in the safety of home, but out in the open, with the sun directly on their backs and no escape at all. Their story is where the human cost of this summer becomes impossible to look away from. While the rest of us are told to stay indoors, draw the blinds and wait out the heat, a vast number of Americans have no such option. Their work demands that they stay outside in the full sun at the hottest hours of the hottest days. For them, a heat dome is not something to hide from. It is a shift they still have to finish. Picture the farm worker in a field at midday, bent over rows of crops under a sky with no cloud in it. There is no shade for miles. The heat radiates up from the bare soil as well as down from the sun, cooking the body from both sides. The work is hard and constant, and hard work generates its own internal heat, piling the body's own warmth on top of the furnace of the day. Every one of those factors stacks the odds against survival. These are the people the heat finds first, and it finds them at their labour. Farm workers picking the food the country eats, construction crews pouring concrete and raising steel, roofers working on surfaces hot enough to blister skin, delivery drivers and warehouse workers and road crews and landscapers. The whole outdoor economy that keeps the country running is staffed by people who cannot simply escape indoors when the temperature climbs into the danger zone. Their bodies face the exact cascade we just traced, but with the safety net removed. There is no cool room waiting a few steps away. The exhaustion comes on in the field, far from help, and the pressure to keep working, to finish the row, to hit the quota, to earn the day's pay, pushes people to ignore the early warnings their bodies are sending. By the time someone stops, they may already be deep into danger. There is a tragic innocence to these deaths, and it echoes a pattern seen again and again in heat waves. The victims were not being reckless. They were doing ordinary, necessary work, the kind of labour that has always been part of summer, on days that once would have been merely uncomfortable. The heat simply no longer plays by the old rules, and jobs built for a cooler climate have quietly turned dangerous. The cruelty runs deeper when you consider who does this work. It is often the people with the least power to say no. Low wages mean the day's pay cannot be skipped. Uncertain employment means complaining about the heat can cost the job. So the very workers most exposed to the danger are the ones least able to protect themselves from it, trapped between a warming sky and an empty wallet. Think of two people in the same heat wave. One sits in a cool office glancing at the brutal number on the forecast with mild curiosity, safe behind glass and conditioned air. The other stands in that number all day, feeling every degree of it press into their skin, with hours still left before the shift ends. Same heat, same city. Two completely different chances of coming home alive. As the country's heat waves grow hotter and longer, the danger to these workers grows with them. The sun does not check anyone's job description before it climbs, and the summer's heat was about to test another group entirely, gathered in the open by the hundreds of thousands, drawn together by the biggest sporting event on the planet. This summer, the extreme heat collided with something enormous. The biggest sporting event in the world had come to the United States, and it filled American cities with vast crowds gathered in the open air, at the exact hours the heat was at its most punishing. Great matches were staged in the middle of the day, under skies with no mercy in them. And a stadium packed with fans on a heat dome afternoon is a special kind of danger, because it concentrates every risk we have met into one small, crowded place. Tens of thousands of bodies packed close together, radiating their own heat into the still air. Concrete and steel all around, soaking up the sun and throwing it back. Long lines for water that cannot keep pace with the need. Little shade, nowhere to retreat. The athletes themselves face the sharpest edge of it. An athlete sprinting through a match in extreme heat is pushing the human body to its limit twice over, once through the sheer effort of the competition, and again through the furnace of the day. Hard exertion pours heat into the body from the inside, and the outside air is too hot and too humid to carry any of it away. Players took shade whenever the game paused. They poured water over their heads. They drank constantly. Their bodies were fighting the same rising core temperature that threatens anyone in the heat, only faster, driven harder by the demands of the sport. And the crowds in the stands faced their own version of the same threat. There is a particular and painful pattern in who suffers during the great social rituals of summer, and this pattern shows itself at exactly these events. People do not stop living because it is hot. They still hold their gatherings, attend their festivals, fill the stands for the matches they have waited years to see. And in heatwave after heatwave, you see people collapse at precisely these moments, at the sporting events and the outdoor celebrations, because the calendar said it was a day for joy, and the sky had other plans. The danger hides inside the excitement. A fan swept up in a thrilling match may not notice the early warnings their body is sending. The dizziness gets blamed on the crowd. The pounding heart gets blamed on the tension of the game. The exhaustion feels like part of the experience. And so the very thrill that drew people out into the sun can mask the exact symptoms that should be sending them into the shade. Cities responded the way they had all summer, with the tools they had. They opened cooling stations, they rolled out vans handing out water, they set up misting fans and cooling towels for the crowds. New York and Chicago and Washington scrambled to protect the people. Their events had drawn outdoors, layering emergency measures over celebrations that were built for a gentler climate. Picture a marathon runner and a spectator standing side by side in the same brutal heat. The runner is burning through their reserves in plain view, watched by trainers ready to pull them out at the first sign of trouble. The spectator is burning through theirs quietly, in a packed crowd, with no one watching at all. It is often the one in the stands, not the one on the field, who slips into danger unseen. The heat had now touched every corner of American life this summer, from the sealed apartment to the open field to the roaring stadium. Yet everything we have seen so far has hovered just short of the ultimate line, the one theory said the human body cannot cross. And the country was beginning, in a few humid corners, to approach it. Remember the survival line from earlier, the wet bulb temperature past which the body's cooling fails, and a healthy adult can die within hours. For most of human history, that line lived only in the hottest, wettest corners of the planet, places like the shores of the Persian Gulf, far from American soil. That comfort has started to crack. The danger in the United States has a specific address, and it is the humid South. Along the Gulf Coast, from Texas through Louisiana and Mississippi and into Florida, the summer air carries an enormous load of moisture, drawn straight off the warm waters of the Gulf. This is the wettest heat in the country, and wet heat, as we have learned, is the kind that defeats the sweat on your skin. On the worst afternoons, the air in these places grows so thick with water that the wet bulb temperature climbs into ranges that push the human body toward its limit. The full theoretical line, the one that fells even a marathon runner, still gets brushed only rarely and briefly. Yet remember the crueler truth from before. For the old and the sick, the deadly line sits far lower. And that lower line, the one that kills the vulnerable, gets crossed across the American South again and again, summer after summer. There is a strange local twist that makes it worse. Across the vast farm country of the middle of the country, the crops themselves pump moisture into the air. Fields of corn stretching to the horizon breathe out water through their leaves on a hot day, in enormous quantities. Farmers and forecasters call it corn sweat. It can lift the humidity of an entire region, driving the wet bulb temperature higher and turning an ordinary hot day across the heartland into something the body struggles to survive. Picture two identical afternoons, both reading 95 degrees on a plain thermometer. One sits in the dry high desert of the west, where sweat flashes off your skin and cools you. The other sits on the swampy Gulf Coast, where the air is already so full of water that your sweat just pools and drips and does nothing. Same number on the screen. One is a hot, survivable day. The other is quietly pushing frail bodies toward the edge. This is why a single national number for heat means so little. The same forecast can be a mild nuisance in one region and a genuine threat to life in another, and the difference lives entirely in the moisture. The map of American heat danger follows the map of American humidity, and it draws its darkest, most lethal band right along the warm, wet southern edge of the country. And this band is widening. As the world warms, the air holds more moisture, because warmer air can carry more water vapor. So the humid, dangerous kind of heat, the wet bulb heat that kills, is expanding its reach, creeping outward from the Gulf, pushing its deadly line farther north with each passing decade. The people who live in these humid places often carry a dangerous confidence. They have heard, all their lives that the real killer is dry desert heat, the kind that hits triple digits out west. They believe their sticky southern summers, uncomfortable as they are, could never be as deadly. That belief is exactly backward, and understanding why means taking apart one of the most stubborn myths in all of American weather. Anyone who has lived in the American Southwest has said it, and probably said it with pride. It is a dry heat. The phrase is meant as reassurance, a way of shrugging off a number that would terrify people anywhere else. 110 degrees sounds unbearable, the thinking goes, but out here in the desert it is fine because the air is dry. There is real truth buried in that phrase, and it is worth honouring before we take it apart. In bone-dry desert air, your sweat evaporates almost the instant it appears. That evaporation is your body's superpower running at full strength, hauling heat off your skin as fast as you can produce it. So a human being genuinely can survive astonishing dry heat, temperatures that would kill within hours in a humid place, as long as there is water to drink and shade to find. The desert is telling a real story about the physics of sweat. The trouble is what the phrase leaves out, and what it leaves out can kill you. Dry heat is survivable only while three conditions hold. You must have enough water to replace everything you sweat, and in that heat you sweat rivers. You must find shade or shelter from a sun strong enough to cook exposed skin, and the heat must ease at night so your body can recover. Take away any one of those, and the comfort of dry heat vanishes in an instant. Consider the true numbers the desert can reach. During recent heat waves, Death Valley has climbed toward 130 degrees, and cities like Palm Springs have passed 120. At those extremes, the margin for error disappears. A car that breaks down on a desert highway becomes a death trap within an hour. A hiker who runs out of water is in mortal danger before they understand what's happening. The dryness that makes the heat survivable also hides how close to the edge it truly is, because you feel less sweat on your skin even as your body pours it out and races toward empty. Then there is the moment the dryness fails. Each summer the desert Southwest draws in a season of moisture, the monsoon rains we met earlier. When that humid air arrives, the dry heat becomes wet heat, and the whole equation flips. Now the sweat stops evaporating. The one thing that made the brutal temperatures survivable is gone, and the same desert that shrugged off dry triple digits suddenly turns lethal at lower numbers. Think of two ovens. One is a dry oven, roasting at a fierce temperature, and you can reach your hand inside for a surprising moment because the dry air carries its heat slowly. The other is a steam oven, set far lower, and it scalds you the instant you open the door, because the wet air dumps its heat into your skin all at once. The desert is the dry oven, the humid south is the steam oven, and a warming world is quietly turning up the moisture everywhere, nudging more of the country toward the steam. So the comforting phrase gets the danger exactly upside down. The dry heat feels safe and can kill through its very deception. The wet heat announces its misery and kills through raw physics. Both are deadly. And the heat is now attacking the body in ways most people never think about, striking first at the one organ working hardest to keep them alive. When heat kills, it usually does its work through the heart. To understand why, you have to see what your body is actually doing on a scorching day, deep beneath the skin, in the quiet machinery that keeps you alive. Your body guards its core temperature with fierce determination, because the organs inside can only function within a narrow band of warmth. When the heat outside climbs, your body launches a rescue operation to shed that heat, and the heart is the engine of the whole effort. To cool down, you must move your hot blood from your core out to your skin, where it can release warmth into the air and where sweat can carry it away. And moving all that blood to the surface falls to the heart. So on a hot day, the heart takes on a second job. It keeps doing its ordinary work, pumping blood to your muscles and brain and organs. On top of that, it now has to pump a great surge of blood out to the skin over and over to run your cooling system. The heart beats faster, it works harder. It labours through the whole hot day and the hot night, a pump asked to do the work of two. For a young, strong heart, this extra labour is a manageable strain. For an older heart, or a heart already weakened by disease, it can be the load that breaks it. The heart races to cool a body it cannot keep up with, and somewhere in that struggle it falters. This is why heat is so lethal to people with heart conditions, and why so many of its victims are older. The heat does not have to reach some exotic extreme. It only has to ask a tired heart for more than it has left to give. Dehydration makes the trap tighter. As you sweat out water hour after hour, the fluid in your bloodstream drops, and your blood grows thicker and harder to pump. Picture the heart trying to push honey through the body instead of water. The thicker blood raises the risk of a clot, and a clot is what causes many heart attacks and strokes. So the heat quietly loads the gun in several ways at once, straining the pump, thickening the fluid, and pushing a fragile system toward the failure it was always closest to. Now the hidden body count from earlier finally makes complete sense. Remember how heat deaths so often get written down as heart attacks and strokes? This is the reason. The heat truly does kill through the heart. The death certificate that says cardiac arrest is telling a kind of truth, while missing the trigger that pulled everything down. The heat lit the fuse. The heart was simply where the explosion happened. Here is a comparison that holds it together. Imagine asking someone to carry a heavy box up a long flight of stairs on an ordinary day. Difficult, but most people manage. Now ask them to do it again and again, all day, with no rest and no water, in a sweltering room. The strongest will struggle. The frail will collapse. The heat turns every hot day into that endless climb for the human heart, and for too many hearts, the climb never ends well. The heat besieges the heart, and it lays siege to something even more central to who we are, the organ that makes every decision, including the decisions that might save our lives. Extreme heat reaches into the brain and changes how we think. This is one of the least understood dangers of a hot day, and one of the most unsettling, because it strikes at the very tool we rely on to protect ourselves. Your brain is a demanding organ. It runs hot even on a cool day, and it depends on your body's cooling systems to keep it in its narrow, safe range. When the heat outside overwhelms those systems, the brain begins to feel it. And a brain running too warm does not work as sharply as a cool one. Thinking slows, focus slips, reaction times stretch out. The mind grows foggy in a way that is hard to notice from the inside, because the very organ that would notice is the one being dulled. Scientists have measured this in careful studies. Students taking tests during heat waves score worse than they would in cool rooms, their minds moving a step slower through every problem. Workers make more mistakes on hot days. Reaction times behind the wheel lengthen, and the rate of traffic accidents ticks upward when the temperature climbs. The heat reaches into the machinery of judgment and quietly loosens the bolts. This has a terrifying edge when it comes to surviving heat itself. Remember how heat exhaustion brings confusion, how a person overheating starts to think poorly and misjudge their situation. The very danger that is killing them also sabotages their ability to recognize it and act. Someone slipping into heat illness may fail to grasp that they need water, shade, help. The trap is sealed by the fog it creates. The heat blunts the alarm that should be screaming at them to save themselves. The changes reach into mood and behavior too, in ways that ripple across a whole society. Researchers have found that tempers grow shorter as the temperature rises. Arguments come more easily. Rates of violence and conflict tend to climb during heat waves, in homes and on streets and across cities. A hot, sleepless, miserable population is an irritable one, and that irritability spills over into real harm. The heat does not only strain individual bodies, it frays the patience that holds a community together. Think of the brain like a powerful computer packed into a small case. Every such machine has a cooling system, a fan whirring to carry heat away from the delicate parts inside. Push the machine too hard in a hot room, and it begins to overheat, and to protect itself it slows down, throttling its own speed, growing sluggish and prone to errors. Overwhelm the cooling entirely and it shuts down. The human brain in extreme heat is that same machine throttling itself, making mistakes, and in the worst cases failing outright. This is the quietest damage heat does, and in some ways the most dangerous, because it attacks our capacity to respond to everything else. A society baking through a long heat wave is a society thinking a little slower, reacting a little later, snapping a little more easily, and struggling a little harder to make the wise choices that heat demands. The furnace reaches into the mind and dims the light we steer by, and the heat's reach extends even further to the most protected and vulnerable human life of all, to a place we imagine no outside danger can touch. We imagine the womb as the safest place in the world, a warm and sheltered harbour sealed off from the storms outside. Extreme heat reaches even there, and what it does has only recently come into focus. a pregnant woman faces the heat with a body already working overtime. She's carrying and cooling not only herself but the developing life within her, and that raises the stakes of every hot day. Her body must shed heat for two, and the growing baby depends entirely on her cooling systems holding steady. When a heat wave pushes those systems toward their limit, the effects can reach inward to the pregnancy itself. Researchers studying this have found a troubling pattern. Exposure to extreme heat during pregnancy appears to raise the risk that a baby arrives too early. Doctors call it preterm birth, and it matters enormously, because a baby born weeks ahead of schedule faces a harder start, with organs and lungs that have not finished getting ready for the world. Across many studies and many places, hot spells line up with a rise in these early births, as though the heat itself hurries the pregnancy toward a dangerous finish. The heat has been linked to other harms as well. Babies exposed to extreme heat in the womb tend, on average, toward lower birth weights, another sign of a harder beginning. And the most serious studies point to a rise in the gravest outcomes during severe heat, the losses that families never fully recover from. The exact biology is still being untangled, but the shape of the danger is clear. The heat that strains a mother's body does not stop at her skin. It reaches through to the life she is carrying. There is a cruel unfairness woven into this. A pregnant woman cannot simply switch off her extra burden and wait for a cooler day. She carries it every hour, through every heat wave, and the poorer she is, the fewer defences she has. A mother working outdoors through a pregnancy, or living in a hot apartment with no way to cool it, faces the heat with the highest stakes and the least protection. The danger falls hardest, once again, on those already carrying the heaviest load. Picture a greenhouse built to nurture a single tender seedling, its temperature held just right, warm and stable and safe. Now imagine a heat wave bearing down on that greenhouse from outside, pressing its warmth against the glass, forcing the temperature within to creep upward past the narrow range the seedling needs. The keeper fights to hold the balance, opening vents, pouring water, straining against the heat. The womb is that greenhouse, and the mother is its keeper, and extreme heat is the force pressing relentlessly against the glass. This is perhaps the clearest sign of how far the reach of extreme heat extends. It touches the newborn and the not yet born. It shapes the very start of a human life, before that life has drawn a single breath. A danger we file away as a summer nuisance turns out to reach into the most protected chamber of the human story. And if the heat can reach the unborn through the shelter of the womb, it takes only a locked door and a few minutes of sun to reach a child already here, in one of the fastest and most preventable tragedies of all. It happens every summer, in ordinary parking lots, to ordinary families. A child is left inside a car on a warm day, and within a shocking span of minutes, that car becomes a trap that can end a young life. Nearly 40 children die this way in the United States in a typical year, and the speed of it defies belief. A parked car in the sun is a solar oven. Sunlight pours through the glass and strikes the seats, the dashboard, the steering wheel, and those surfaces drink it in and radiate heat back into the sealed cabin. The heat has nowhere to go. It builds with astonishing speed. On a warm day, the temperature inside a closed car can climb by 20 degrees in just 10 minutes and keep rising from there, pushing past 120 degrees, even toward 140. A pleasant afternoon outside becomes a furnace behind the glass. Now add the terrible fact that makes children so vulnerable. A young child's body heats up 3 to 5 times faster than an adult's. Their small bodies gain heat quickly, and their cooling systems are less able to fight back. So a temperature that would leave an adult drenched and miserable can push a small child into deadly heat stroke with frightening speed. More than half of the children who die this way are under the age of 2, too young to open a door, unbuckle a seat, or even call out in a way that carries. The cruelest detail is how these tragedies usually happen. Most people assume only a careless or cruel parent could leave a child in a hot car. The truth is gentler and more frightening. In more than half of these deaths, a loving caregiver simply forgot. A change in routine, a quiet sleeping baby, an exhausted and distracted mind, and a parent walks away believing they already dropped the child off. It is a failure of memory that can happen to almost anyone, and it turns devoted parents into the unwilling authors of an unimaginable loss. Rolling the windows down are cracked as almost nothing. Parking in the shade buys only a little time. As long as the sun keeps heating the surfaces inside, the cabin stays deadly. The car is simply built to trap heat, and a small body inside cannot win that fight. Think of a magnifying glass held over dry grass in the sun. The glass gathers the sunlight and concentrates it into a single burning point, and what was gentle warmth becomes fierce enough to scorch. A car's windows do a version of the same thing, letting the sun's energy in and refusing to let the heat back out, concentrating an ordinary day into a lethal one. The child inside sits at the focus of that trap. These deaths carry a special weight, because every one of them was preventable. No storm caused them, no drought, no failing power grid. Just a few minutes, a locked car, and the sun. Safety experts plead with parents to build habits, to place a bag in the back seat, to look before they lock. And still, summer after summer, the count climbs, because the human mind is fallible and the sun is merciless. The heat finds the youngest and the smallest with terrible ease. It also finds the oldest, in a way that reveals something painful about how we live now, and about who we have quietly left alone. Return for a moment to the sealed apartments of Chicago in 1995, and to the profile of the people who died there. They were old, they were poor, and above all, they were alone. That last word holds a lesson that reaches far beyond one city and one summer, into the way an entire country now lives. When researchers study who dies in heat waves, the same risk factor rises to the top again and again: isolation. The single strongest thing that separates those who survive a dangerous heat wave from those who do not is often whether someone was watching over them. A person living alone, with few visitors and no daily check, faces the heat with no safety net. When the fog of a heat illness creeps over them and dulls their judgment, there is no one to notice, no one to bring water, no one to call for help. They slip away in silence, in a hot room, with no one to see it happening. This is the quiet horror at the centre of heat as a killer. It preys on the disconnected. In the Chicago disaster, the neighbourhoods that fared best were the ones with life on the streets, where people knew their neighbours and checked on the elderly, where a closed door and a silent apartment would draw a knock. The neighbourhoods that fared worst were the ones where fear and isolation kept people sealed inside, unknown to those around them. The difference between life and death often came down to whether anyone would notice you were gone. And here is why this lesson is growing more urgent, not less. Across the country, more people live alone than ever before. The population is ageing, with a rising number of older adults, many of them living by themselves, far from family, in a society that has grown more scattered and more private. The exact conditions that made isolation deadly in Chicago are becoming more common with each passing year. We are building a country with more and more people who could vanish in a heat wave and go unmissed until it was far too late. The heat, in this sense, tests the strength of our human bonds. It measures how connected we truly are, how well we watch over the vulnerable among us. A society woven tightly together, where neighbours know neighbours and no elderly person goes a hot day unchecked, can save most of its people through nothing more than attention. A society come loose at the seams, where the old and the frail live unseen, hands its most vulnerable straight to the heat. Think of a smoke alarm sounding in an empty house. The danger is real, the alarm is blaring, and it means nothing, because there is no one to hear it and act. A person overheating alone in a sealed apartment is that alarm with no one listening. Their body is signalling distress in every way it can, and the signal reaches no one. The tragedy is less about the heat itself than about the silence that surrounds them. This is a danger we can actually do something about, and cheaply, through the simplest of acts. A phone call, a knock on a door, a neighbour remembered. The heat exposes our isolation, and in doing so it points to a defence that costs nothing but care. Yet there is one group the country has locked away from even that hope of a knock, held in conditions that turn a heat wave into a punishment no court ever handed down. There is a place in America where people cannot flee the heat, cannot open a window for a breeze, cannot drive to a cooling centre, cannot even choose when to drink water. They are the incarcerated, and across much of the country their cells become furnaces every summer, in conditions a federal judge has called plainly unconstitutional. Consider Texas, the state that locks up more people per capita than any other. Roughly 2 out of every 3 of its prison inmates live in buildings without full air conditioning. When a heat wave settles over the state, and summer temperatures there routinely soar past 100 degrees for weeks, the heat pours into those concrete buildings and stays. The heat index inside the cells can climb past 110 degrees, and in the worst spots it has been recorded far higher still, turning a place of confinement into a slow oven with no escape. The people inside face this heat stripped of every defense we have talked about. They cannot leave. Many of them are older or sick or taking medications for heart conditions and mental illness, the very drugs that make a body less able to handle heat. They are, in the language of Risk, one of the most vulnerable populations imaginable, and they are held in some of the hottest conditions in the country by the state itself. The stories of how they survive are wrenching. Inmates have described splashing water from their toilets onto their bodies to cool down. Some have faked medical emergencies to be moved to the cooler medical wing. Some have set fires in their cells so that guards would be forced to hose the cell down and bring a few minutes of relief. These are the desperate acts of people fighting for their lives against the temperature of the room they cannot leave, and people die. During one recent record heatwave, an analysis found that at least 40 incarcerated people died in the state's uncooled prisons. A careful study of deaths over nearly 2 decades estimated that during the warm months, roughly 1 in 8 of all deaths in Texas, prisons without full cooling could be traced to extreme heat. The heat is doing quiet, steady killing behind those walls, largely out of public sight. The injustice sharpens when you learn the double standard. Local jails in the same state have been required for decades to keep their temperatures within a safe range. Federal prisons regulate their heat, and more than a dozen states across the country still hold people in prisons without universal cooling. So the protection depends entirely on which door closed behind you. Sentenced to one kind of facility, you are kept at a livable temperature. Sentenced to another, you face a summer of dangerous heat that no judge ever wrote into your punishment. Think of a sentence hidden inside a sentence. The court hands down a term of years, a punishment defined and limited by law. Then the building itself adds a second, unwritten punishment, delivered by the sun, that can escalate all the way to death. That extra sentence was never spoken in any courtroom, yet it falls on every person held in those cells. The heat then reaches even into the places we build to hold people, and finds the ones with the very least power to escape it. But its reach is not limited to human bodies. It attacks the very bones of the country, the concrete and steel we built to last, in ways that are starting to make the modern world itself buckle. Extreme heat does more than harm bodies. It attacks the physical bones of the country, the roads and rails and bridges we built and assumed would simply endure. And this summer, in the heat, the ground itself began to give way. Start with the roads. A highway looks permanent, a solid ribbon of concrete and asphalt built to carry millions of tons of traffic. Yet those materials expand when they heat up, growing ever so slightly larger as the temperature climbs. Engineers build in gaps and joints to give the pavement room to swell. Push the heat far enough, though, and the expansion overwhelms those defences. The slabs press against each other with enormous force, and with nowhere left to go, they buckle upward, cracking and heaving into jagged ridges. This summer, drivers in the Midwest came upon roads that had erupted into ramps of broken pavement, some cars catching air as they hit the sudden rise at speed. The railways face the same enemy in an even more dangerous form. Steel rails expand in the heat exactly as the pavement does, and when a long line of rail heats up with no room to grow, it can bend and warp sideways out of its proper line. Railroaders have a name for these heat-warped tracks. They call them sun kinks, and a sun kink can throw a train off the rails. To prevent that, rail operators are forced to slow their trains down during extreme heat, running them at reduced speed so a warped rail is less likely to cause disaster. The whole system creeps, hobbled by the temperature. Bridges strain too. Like the roads and rails, they are designed with joints that let them expand and contract with the seasons. Extreme heat pushes that expansion toward the edge of what the joints were built to absorb, and engineers have watched drawbridges swell so much in the heat that they could no longer close properly, stuck open until crews sprayed them with water to cool and shrink the metal. The reason all of this is happening now traces back to a single quiet assumption. Every road, every rail, every bridge was designed for a particular climate, engineered to handle the range of temperatures its builders expected it to face over its lifetime. That expected range was set by the weather of the past. Now the heat is climbing beyond the numbers those designs were built around, asking the infrastructure to endure conditions it was never meant to see. The bones of the country were built for an America that is slipping away. Picture a door fitted perfectly into its frame in the mild days of spring, opening and closing with a smooth, easy swing. Then comes a spell of intense heat, and the wood of the door swells, growing just large enough that it no longer fits its frame. It sticks, it jams, you have to force it. Now imagine that same swelling happening to every road and rail and bridge across a continent at once, each one straining against the frame it was built for. That is a nation's infrastructure in a severe heat wave, swollen past its fit, jamming and buckling and warping under a heat its designers never planned for. If the heat can make the solid ground itself heave and the steel rails writhe, it should come as no surprise that it can also reach up into the sky and pluck airplanes out of the air before they ever leave the runway. There is a kind of heat so extreme that airplanes simply cannot take off in it. It sounds like something invented, a strange rumour. It is real. It has grounded flights at major American airports, and the reason reveals something deep about the physics of a warming world. An airplane flies because of air. The wing works by moving fast through the air, and the countless air molecules streaming over and under it generate the lift that holds the enormous machine aloft. The engines too breathe air, gulping it in to make their power. Everything about flight depends on there being enough air, packed densely enough, for the wing to grip and the engines to swallow. Now, recall a fact we met when we first talked about heat domes. Hot air is thinner than cool air. When air heats up, its molecules spread apart, and the same volume of air holds fewer of them. So on an extremely hot day, the air over the runway grows thin, sparse, stretched out. And thin air is treacherous for an airplane trying to take off. There are fewer molecules for the wing to push against, so the plane generates less lift. There are fewer molecules for the engines to breathe, so they make less power. The machine strains to leave the ground. To fly in that thin, hot air, an airplane must go faster to make up for the missing lift, which means it needs a longer stretch of runway to reach that higher speed. Push the heat far enough, and the runway is simply not long enough for the plane to get airborne safely. At that point, the only responsible choice is to stay on the ground. This is more than theory. It has happened. During an extreme heat wave, temperatures at the Phoenix airport climbed toward 120 degrees, and airlines cancelled dozens of flights, unable to safely fly certain aircraft in air that thin. Smaller regional jets are the most vulnerable, with some rated to operate only up to around 118 degrees. Once the thermometer passes their limit, those planes are grounded. Larger jets can handle more, with limits closer to 126 or 127 degrees, and even those numbers are within reach of the hottest American afternoons. Elevation makes it worse. Airports built high above sea level already sit in thinner air, so their heat threshold for trouble is lower still. Combine high elevation with extreme heat, and the margin for a heavily loaded plane shrinks fast. Think of a swimmer trying to push off from the wall of a pool. In deep water, there is plenty to press against, and they launch forward with power. Now imagine the water growing thinner and thinner, until there is barely anything to push against at all. The swimmer's kick finds no purchase, and they can hardly move. A wing in extremely hot, thin air is that kick finding nothing to grip. The plane wants to fly, and the sky itself has grown too thin to hold it up. So the heat reaches even into the modern miracle of flight and quietly closes it down. A hot enough day can strand travellers, halt airplanes, and remind us that our technology floats on a thin cushion of ordinary air that heat can steal away. By now, a question has surely been building. Why is all of this happening now, all at once, with such force? To answer it honestly, scientists had to invent a way to read the fingerprints on the heat itself. Whenever a monstrous heat wave strikes, the same question rises. Is this just weather, the kind of hot spell that has always come and gone, or is something larger at work behind it? For a long time, scientists could only shrug and say it was hard to know. That has changed. They have built a way to read the fingerprints on an individual heat wave, and what they are finding should stop us cold. The method is a marvel of cleverness, and at its heart it is a controlled experiment run on the whole planet. Scientists take the powerful computer models they use to simulate Earth's climate, and they run them in two versions. In the first, they model the world as it actually is today, with all the extra heat-trapping gases humans have poured into the air over the past century. In the second, they model an imaginary world, identical in every way except that the extra gases were never added, a version of Earth where the industrial age never changed the air. Then they ask a simple, devastating question. How likely was this exact heat wave in each world? By running the two versions many times, they can compare the odds. If a heat wave that was common in the real world was vanishingly rare in the clean imaginary world, then human warming clearly loaded the dice. The gap between the two sets of odds is the fingerprint, a measurement of exactly how much human influence shaped the disaster. The results coming out of this work are stark. Consider a heat dome that baked the American Southwest earlier in this very year, driving temperatures to extraordinary heights for the season. Scientists ran the two worlds and found that this event was roughly 800 times more likely because of human-caused warming. In the imaginary clean world, they concluded, a heat wave like it would have been virtually impossible. It essentially could not have happened without the changes we have made to the air. Sit with that phrase, virtually impossible without us. This is a different kind of statement than the old cautious talk of climate change raising general risks over long spans of time. This is science pointing at a specific heat wave, one that actually happened, and saying it was our doing, almost beyond doubt. The fingerprints are not smudged or vague. They are clear enough to hold up in the harsh light of peer review. Picture a pair of dice that keep rolling the same high number again and again, far more often than luck allows. You suspect the dice are loaded, but you cannot prove it from a single roll. So you build a fair set of dice, roll both sets thousands of times, and compare. The fair dice almost never hit that number. The suspect dice hit it constantly. Now you have your proof, measured and undeniable. That is exactly what climate scientists have done with heat waves, and the verdict on the loaded dice is in. This is the deeper truth the whole story has been circling. The reason America keeps shattering heat records, the reason the domes lock in and the nights refuse to cool, is not some run of bad luck or a natural cycle acting alone. Our fingerprints are on it, measurable and clear, and once you accept that, a chilling thought follows close behind. If we are the ones loading the dice, then the summers our children inherit will be rolled with dice loaded far more heavily than ours. Here is a strange and quiet danger hidden inside a warming world. Each generation grows up thinking the climate of its own childhood is normal, the natural baseline against which everything else is measured. And as the heat climbs, that baseline creeps upward, so that each new generation accepts as ordinary a level of heat that would have shocked the one before. The heat of today's American summers would have stunned people a few generations back. The number of heat waves striking major cities in the United States has roughly doubled since the 1980s. A child growing up now experiences a summer that their grandparents would have called extraordinary, a season of heat advisories and cooling centres and triple-digit warnings that were far rarer in the world the grandparents knew. Yet to the child, it is simply summer. It is all they have ever known. This quiet shifting of the baseline is one of the most insidious things about a warming climate. It hides the change inside the ordinary passage of time. No single summer feels like a catastrophe, because each one is only a little hotter than the last, and memory is short. We adjust. We shrug. We call it a hot year, and move on. And over decades, those small adjustments stack into an enormous shift that no one quite watched happen. Scientists have tried to make the coming change concrete, to show families what their own children will actually face. In one careful projection, researchers looked at the 7 hottest days a community endures in a year today, and calculated how many days that same brutal heat would strike 30 years from now. Across the country on average, those 7 hottest days are projected to become 18. The rarest, most extreme heat of today becomes a regular feature of the calendar for the next generation. In the hottest places, the shift is even sharper. In the Miami area, the 7 hardest days of heat that people endure now are projected to multiply many times over within a single lifetime. Think of what that means for a child born today. The heat that their parents brace for as the worst of the summer The few punishing days everyone dreads and plans around will be ordinary weather by the time that child is grown. They will build their whole sense of normal around a level of heat their parents considered a crisis, and their own children in turn will inherit a baseline hotter still and call that normal too. Picture a family measuring their children's height against a doorframe, marking each year with a pencil line. Now imagine the floor of the house slowly rising, a fraction of an inch each year, so gradually that no one notices from day to day. The pencil marks keep climbing, and everyone assumes the children are simply growing. Only when you step back and compare the floor to where it began decades later, do you see how far it has risen. The baseline of American heat is that slowly rising floor, lifting under our feet while we mark our ordinary lives against it. This is why the phrase "about to get worse" carries such weight. The trajectory points in one direction, and the projections do more than count hotter days. They redraw the map of the country itself, painting a vast new region where the heat will reach levels once found only in the planet's most hostile corners. Researchers studying America's future have identified something that sounds like a warning from a darker century. They call it the extreme heat belt, and it is a great swath of the country projected to face heat so severe it was once found only in the world's most hostile deserts. Here is what they mean by extreme. On the scale weather services use to measure how hot the air feels to a human body, the very top of the danger range sits around a heat index of 125 degrees. That is a level so punishing it can threaten anyone exposed to it, the kind of reading associated with the floor of Death Valley or parts of the Middle East. Today, only a small handful of American counties, home to a few million people, are expected to hit that extreme mark in a given year. Now look 30 years ahead. In that same projection, the number of counties expected to reach that top danger level explodes into the thousands. The region that will face it forms a broad band across the middle of the country, running up from the Gulf states of Texas and Louisiana, through the heartland, all the way north toward the Great Lakes and the edge of the upper Midwest. Inside that belt, more than 100 million Americans could face days of that most extreme heat every single year. A quarter of the country's land would fall under it. Sit with the strangeness of that map. The most extreme heat on the scale, the kind we associate with the emptiest deserts on Earth, is projected to arrive in the ordinary, populated heartland of America. In cities and towns built for a temperate climate, in places with green lawns and shade trees and school football fields, in the middle of the country where families have farmed and lived for generations. The desert is not staying in the desert. It is spreading north into the places where most of us actually live. The consequences ripple far beyond discomfort. A region that regularly hits such heat becomes a harder place to live in every way. Working outdoors grows dangerous for much of the summer. The demands on the power grid climb toward the breaking point we saw earlier. The cost of simply keeping people cool and alive rises year after year. And slowly, quietly, such heat begins to shape where people can comfortably live at all, nudging the long, deep decisions families make about where to build their lives. Think of a stain spreading across a map. It begins as a few small dark spots in the hottest southern corners, easy to overlook. Then, decade by decade, the stain widens and darkens and creeps outward, bleeding up through the centre of the country until a vast band of the map has turned the deep colour of extreme danger. That spreading stain is the extreme heat belt taking shape, and the places it covers are not empty. They are full of homes and schools and hospitals and people. One researcher put it in words that are hard to forget. If people think the recent brutal summers are hot, he warned, then these will be among the coolest summers of the rest of their lives. The heat we are struggling with now is the cool end of what is coming. Faced with a future this stark, it is no wonder that people reach for explanations big enough to match it. And some of those explanations, however tempting, lead in exactly the wrong direction. Whenever the records fall and the maps turn deep red, a certain set of explanations begins to spread. The heat, some say, is being made on purpose. Governments or hidden programs are manufacturing these heat waves through secret weather control, seeding the sky, steering the climate for reasons unknown. It is worth taking this idea seriously enough to actually examine, because the people asking are usually looking at something real and frightening and reaching for an answer big enough to hold it. The instinct behind the idea is understandable. A deliberate cause almost feels comforting. because a thing that someone built on purpose is a thing that could, in principle, be switched off. If a shadowy program made the heat, then stopping the program would stop the heat. The alternative, that we have accidentally changed the whole atmosphere through the ordinary business of daily life, is in some ways harder to face, because there is no single switch to flip. The trouble is that the physics simply does not allow the deliberate version. To understand why, you have to grasp the sheer scale of energy inside a heat wave. A continental heat dome is one of the largest and most powerful structures in all of nature. The amount of energy it contains is staggering, beyond anything human technology can create, move, or steer. There is no machine, no fleet of aircraft, no secret facility capable of building or directing an atmospheric feature that vast. Asking whether humans could manufacture a heat dome on purpose is like asking whether someone could throw an ocean. The energy involved lives on a scale that dwarfs everything we can do directly. What about the one real weather technology people point to, the practice of seeding clouds to coax out rain? That technology is genuine, and it is modest. Under the right conditions, it can nudge a cloud that was already going to rain into releasing a little more water than it otherwise would. That is the whole of its power. It works only on clouds already primed to rain, and it changes the outcome only slightly. It cannot conjure a hemisphere-spanning ridge of high pressure. It cannot summon a heat dome out of clear air. The gap between what that technology can actually do and what the conspiracy imagines is the gap between a garden hose and a flood. So the pattern we are living through has a full and precise explanation, and it is the one we have been building throughout this whole story. The slowed river of wind, the blocking pattern that locks the dome in place, the warmed baseline that lifts every temperature higher, the measured fingerprints of human-caused warming on individual heat waves. Every piece fits, and together they explain the heat completely, with no need for any secret machine. And here is the part worth sitting with. The true explanation is more frightening than the myth, not less. A deliberate program could be exposed and shut down. What we actually face has no hidden operator to arrest, no facility to storm. The cause is woven into the ordinary workings of the modern world, into the way billions of us live each day. That is a harder problem, and a more sobering one, because fixing it asks something of everyone rather than pointing at a villain. Which brings us at last to the only question that truly matters now. Faced with a heat that is real, that is worsening, and that is ours, what can we actually do about it? After all of this, the danger, the hidden deaths, the buckling roads, the spreading belt of unbearable heat, a person could be forgiven for feeling helpless. Yet the story does not end in helplessness, because there are real, concrete things that save lives in a heat wave, and cities across America are beginning to reach for them. Start with the simplest and most powerful defense, a cool place to go. When a heat wave strikes, opening cooling centers, air-conditioned public buildings where anyone can escape the heat for free, saves lives directly. Cities this summer opened these centers, sent workers to check on vulnerable residents, and rolled out vans handing water to people in the streets. These measures are humble, and they work. A single cool room, open to those who have none, can be the difference between a survivable heat wave and a deadly one. Then there is the deeper work of reshaping the cities themselves, of undoing the urban heat island one street at a time. Planting trees along bare streets brings shade and the natural cooling of leaves, dropping neighborhood temperatures noticeably. Painting roofs white or in reflective colors, so they bounce sunlight away instead of drinking it in, cools the buildings beneath them. Choosing lighter pavements that absorb less heat cools whole blocks. City by city, these changes can shave the killing edge off a heat wave, and they help most in exactly the poor, paved, treeless neighborhoods that suffer worst. The power grid needs the same forward thinking, hardening and expanding so it can carry the soaring demand of the hottest days, without failing at the moment lives depend on it. And communities can build early warning systems that alert people before a dangerous heat wave arrives, giving them time to prepare, to check on neighbors, to plan. There is a quiet revolution underway in how seriously we take heat at all. Some cities have begun appointing officials whose entire job is to manage the threat of extreme heat, treating it as the major hazard it has always been. Some have started giving heat waves names and ranking them by severity, the way we name and rank hurricanes, so that a nameless, invisible danger becomes something people can see coming, talk about, and respect. Naming the threat is the first step toward defending against it, and running beneath all of these fixes is the human defense we met earlier, the one that costs nothing. The knock on the door, the phone call to an elderly relative, the neighbour remembered on the hottest day. Since isolation is the strongest predictor of who dies, connection is one of the strongest defences, available to every single one of us at no cost but a little care. Think of a town beside a river that floods. It can do nothing and be swept away each spring, or it can build levees, plant trees along the banks, sound alarms when the waters rise, and teach every neighbour to watch out for those living closest to the edge. The flood still comes. But a prepared town survives what an unprepared town does not. We are that town, and the rising river is the heat, and we already know how to build the levees. None of these defences stops the heat from coming. They change how many people it takes when it arrives, and that difference, measured in lives, is enormous. Which leaves one final question, the one this whole story has been carrying toward from the very first record that fell in Washington. We began beneath a dome of hot air pressing down on the nation's capital, on the hottest 4th of July that city had ever recorded. We have travelled a long way since then, through the invisible machinery of the heat, the hidden count of its dead, the bodies and minds and infrastructure it strains, and the vast belt of unbearable heat it is drawing across the future of the country. Now we arrive at the only thing that still remains open, the choice. Everything we have seen carries a single, clear message. The heat is real, it is worsening, and its fingerprints trace back to us. That could sound like a sentence with no appeal, a door already closed. It is the opposite. Because a danger we created is a danger we have some power over. If our own actions loaded the dice, then our own actions still shape how heavily they are loaded for the generations who come after us. Two futures stretch out ahead, and the distance between them is enormous. In one, we treat the heat with the seriousness it has earned. We cool our cities and shade our streets and harden our grids. We watch over the vulnerable and refuse to let the isolated die unseen. We slow the warming that drives the whole crisis, easing the load on the dice for our children. In that future, the heat still comes, harder than before, but a prepared and awake society meets it and holds its losses down. In the other future, we look away. We let the baseline creep upward unwatched, calling each hotter summer normal and moving on. We leave the old and the poor and the imprisoned to face the furnace alone. We let the belt of extreme heat spread across the heartland unchallenged. In that future, the quiet killer keeps its silence, and the empty chairs multiply year after year, and a country that could have acted simply endures a rising toll it chose not to prevent. The heat itself does not care which future we pick. It follows the physics, the loaded dice, the warming air. The choosing belongs entirely to us. And it is being made right now, not in some distant council chamber, but in 10,000 ordinary decisions, in how we build our cities and run our power and watch over our neighbours and change the way we live. Here is the truth to carry out of all of this. The heatwave that cooked Washington was a warning written in a broken record and a crowd on stretchers. The summer that followed, flipping its dome from coast to coast, was the warning repeated louder, and the projections reaching decades ahead are the warning shouted as plainly as science knows how to shout. The danger has announced itself in every way it can. What it cannot do is decide for us. It cannot make us plant the tree, harden the grid, knock on the door, or change the course we're on. That is ours alone to do, and the window in which we can shape the outcome will not stay open forever. So the heat is coming, harder and wider and more relentless than the country has ever faced. The only question left is whether we'll meet it awake or asleep. The choice is still in our hands. Let us not waste it.